Okay, there was a printout that Kaidi was... Oh, do you have copies of the printout?
Yes, I will take it. I will take it. I have some copies in the office.
Oh, okay. Okay, they were to be sent out with the announcement of the class, so I think most people would have gotten them. But if there are any people, if there's any person who needs a copy, Kaidi will bring a few more. Okay, so the sutta we're taking today is sutta number 60 in the Middle Age Discourses. This is called the Apannaka Sutta. Okay, so we are on page 506. So the Apannaka Sutta, the word Apannaka, it's explained, but it's a very unusual word, but it's explained by the commentary to have the meaning of certain, definite, unambiguous. But here it's rendered incontrovertible. And what is sort of going to be explained in this sutta is a little bit like a Buddha's counterpart to, you know, the expression Pascal's wager, Pascal's bet. Pascal was a French philosopher, theologian, I think of the 17th century. And he was considering, you know, the article of Catholic faith is that you have to believe in God. So he was considering whether one should believe in God or not. And the consequence is that, you know, I guess he was confronted with some scientific facts which seemed to undermine the existence of God, maybe some logical reasoning which seemed to refute belief in the existence of God. So he reflected and he considered what is the consequence of believing in God. Well, if God does exist and you believe in God and in the tenets of the Catholic faith, then you get eternal life in heaven. If God doesn't exist and you believe in God, well, you just have a false belief and you could live a moral life, and when you die, then everything comes to an end. But if you don't believe in God and God exists, according to the belief of Christianity, then you get consigned to hell forever. And so then you have to spend eternity in hell. Whereas if God does exist and you do believe, if God does exist and you do believe in God, then you get to spend eternity in heaven. So reflecting logically in that way, it makes sense to believe in God. Okay, so this will be the Buddha's reflection, not so much, not on the question whether or not one should believe in God, but whether or not it makes sense to believe in teachings like rebirth and karma. Okay, so when the sutta begins, the Buddha has been traveling through the Kosalan country, and he arrives at a Brahmin village in the Kosalan country named Sala. Okay, so now the Brahmin householders of Sala hear that the Buddha has arrived in their town, and so they hear a favorable report about him, and they decide to go to visit him. And presumably, at the beginning of this discourse, the Brahmins of Sala are not followers of the Buddha, so they don't have a convinced faith in him, but they're interested to hear his teaching. Okay, so they come to the Buddha, and then some pay homage to the Buddha and sit down to one side. Those are the ones who know basic principles of courtesy and respect. Some exchange friendly greetings with him, and then sit down to one side. Others extend, they do gasho, it's called gasho in Japanese, or anjali in Pali and Sanskrit, and the gesture of reverential salutation and sit down to one side. Some just declare their names and sit down on one side, and then some, these are probably the skeptics, the cynics, who just want to hear what this wandering ascetic has to say, they just keep silent and sit down to one side. Okay, so then when they're seated, then the Buddha asks them whether they have any kind of definite faith in a spiritual teacher, a faith which is supported by reasons. And so the Brahmins say that they have no convinced faith in any particular teacher. And so now the Buddha is going to give them a teaching which will be appropriate for them in their present situation. Notice he's not going to try to lay the Four Noble Truths on them, to teach them about the three characteristics, impermanence, suffering, non-self. He's not going to teach them dependent origination. These are the deep dharmas specific to the Buddha. But what the Buddha is going to try to do is to give them a teaching which, if they reflect on this teaching properly according to the lines he's going to lay down, they'll find reasonable to accept and to use as a basis for their conduct. And so this method of reflection that the Buddha is going to teach them will be able to lead them, to guide them to proper types of conduct which will lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. So at this point, the Buddha is not yet intent on trying to give them a teaching that's going to lead them to liberation, to nibbana, to enlightenment, but just to give them a kind of template of a basic understanding that they can use as the foundation for ethical conduct and that will promote their well-being and happiness in this life and in future lives. If some of them, through listening to the Buddha, then gain trust and confidence in the Buddha and open their minds to understand the deeper teaching, then the Buddha will systematically present to them the teachings that lead to liberation. But at this point, these Brahmin householders, are not yet ready for those types of teachings. Okay, so now what the Buddha is going to do initially is to lay out three types of views which are set in contrasting pairs of a wrong view and the corresponding type of right view. And the three types of wrong view are called, I think this is a commentarial expression, niyata michaditti. I'll write that. Michaditti means wrong view, and niyata means fixed or definite. So these are the fixed, definite types of wrong view, and they're called fixed and definite because when one adopts this type of view and holds to it strongly, becomes completely convinced about it, it blocks off the pathways to a higher rebirth and to eventual liberation. And then these three types of wrong views are going to be contrasted in each section with the corresponding type of right view. Okay, so the Buddha begins in the first section. I've sort of mapped these out on this handout. So the first type of wrong view is called, we translate it as nihilism. The Pali expression here, natigavada, means literally the view there is not, or it's a kind of denialist view, the view that denies certain sort of fixed principles of the ethical life, especially against the background of the Buddha's time. Okay, so here comes this first type of wrong view, the view of nihilism. This asserts there is nothing given, nothing offered, nothing sacrificed or given in charity. Of course, this is not denying that one person can give anything to another, but what it is denying is that there is any benefit, any justification for such actions as giving out of faith and trust to others, giving out of compassion or kindness to others, making offerings, giving in charity. There is no fruit or result of good and bad actions. So there are actions which we judge conventionally to be good, to wholesome, worthy actions. Other actions are judged to be bad, unwholesome, unworthy actions. And what these teachers are saying is that these good and bad actions don't have any kind of karmic result. In other words, there's no law of karma that underlies the operation of human activity to ensure that good actions produce happiness and bad actions lead to suffering. Okay, the next seems a little bit strange. There is not this world, there is not another world. Actually, these teachers, of course, they don't deny that this world exists, but what this means is that there's no coming back in the form of rebirth, coming back into this world, and no taking rebirth in any other world beyond this. What they would probably say is this world of solid matter, made up of the four elements, that is the only world that exists, and when you die, everything is finished, the body just disintegrates into the material elements, it gets buried, burned, scattered to the winds, and everything is finished. Okay, there is no mother and no father. Of course, you might think that these ascetics, having maybe renounced in childhood, don't have any understanding of how children come into the world. But that's not the reason why they make this statement. But what they're saying is that there's no obligation or no kind of ethical duty to support one's mother and father. There's no gratitude, no debt of gratitude due to one's mother and father. Okay, the next phrase I had translated, there are no beings who are reborn spontaneously, but I have to revise that translation. The Pali word here that's been translated, beings who are reborn spontaneously, in some contexts, this word has that special meaning of beings who are reborn in some of the heavenly worlds, also in the hell realms, without any parents, but they just arise instantaneously, spontaneously. But here I checked the commentary on this just earlier this morning, and I found that the commentary says that here the word Upapatika means simply that there are no beings who are reborn. So in other words, they simply deny that there are any beings who, after passing away, take rebirth. And then they say that there are no good and virtuous recluses and Brahmins in the world who have themselves realized by direct knowledge the nature of this world and the other world, and can explain them and teach them on the basis of their own personal knowledge. So in other words, here they're denying that there are any kind of spiritual renunciants who have achieved superior knowledge, abhinyas, by which they can see the workings of the law of karma, the different realms of existence, and how beings take rebirth in accordance with their deeds. Okay, so that is the thesis of nihilism, or Nattikavada, the denial, basically, that good and bad deeds bring their results, or we could say it's a philosophical materialism which holds that a person consists only of the material factors, and that with death there comes a complete termination of consciousness, mind, personal existence, that everything is terminated with death. And you find in the Majjhima Nikaya there's also a full statement of this view in Sutta number 76. You can look that up on your own. Okay, now the opposite of the nihilist position is the doctrine of, here we use a rather unwieldy expression, affirmationism, or simply in Pali, Attikavada means the doctrine there is, the doctrine of existence. And this is simply the exact opposite in all respects of the doctrine of nihilism. So these ascetics who hold this doctrine say there is what is given, offered, what is given in charity, there's the fruit and result of good and bad deeds, there is this world, there is rebirth into this world and into other worlds, there is virtue in looking after and supporting and helping one's mother and father, there is a rebirth that takes place after death, and so beings are reborn, and there are good and virtuous ascetics and Brahmins who have realized for themselves the nature of this world and the world beyond, and can explain them on the basis of their personal knowledge. Okay, so these two different types of teachers hold doctrines that are diametrically opposed to one another. Okay, so now the Buddha is at this section that I marked 7a1. The Buddha is going to now enter into an examination, first of the doctrine of nihilism, the doctrine of annihilation. So he says that if an ascetic or Brahmin teaches a doctrine like this, first we look what will be the likely effect on their conduct. And he says, if we consider this, it is to be expected that they will avoid three types of wholesome qualities. That is, good bodily conduct, good verbal conduct, and good mental conduct. And that they will undertake and practice three types of unwholesome states or unwholesome lines of conduct. That is, bodily misconduct, verbal misconduct, and mental misconduct. And then the Buddha gives the reason why this particular view will lead to this type of conduct. The reason is that these ascetics and Brahmins do not see in unwholesome qualities or unwholesome actions the danger, degradation, and defilement, nor do they see in wholesome qualities the blessing of renunciation, the aspect of cleansing. Now this line of reflection, it occurs to me with regard to this line of reflection that it seems to be set against the the culture in India in the time of the Buddha. And in some respects it doesn't completely correspond, in my own experience, to the way things work out in the contemporary age. Because I know quite a number of people who don't believe in any existence beyond the present one, who don't believe in that there's something like a law of karma which ensures that the actions we do in this life will produce results in some future life, either happiness or suffering. And yet, these people uphold very high standards of ethical conduct, not based on considering what will be the consequences for myself in some future life, but just what does my conscience tell me about how I should act in relation to other human beings, other living creatures, the natural environment in this life here and now. So I think the reflection that we have here maybe shouldn't be taken to be universally applicable under all conditions, applicable to all cultures, to all periods of human history. But it seems that perhaps during the Buddha's time, almost every sort of decent, respectable, upright person was expected to accept a doctrine of lives beyond the present one, and to accept the teaching of karma and rebirth. And so if somebody forcefully and insistently rejected those doctrines, one could suspect that they would tend to engage in unwholesome types of behavior. Does anybody have any comments about this?
Well, yeah, I would think that that would tend to be true in a Brahmin society, because if you did not follow the conceptions of the priests and so on, then you would be outcast from society generally. That is, you'd be beyond the pale, and so you would be in a hostile relationship to all your relatives.
Yeah. Though also it's a little bit curious that the text says that there are some recluses and Brahmins whose doctrine, whose view and doctrine is this, that there is nothing given, nothing offered, nothing sacrificed, and so on. And the one to whom this position is assigned, Ajita Kesa Kambali, no, he doesn't seem to have been a Brahmin, but it seems that there could have been Brahmins who did make this assertion.
I think it's the Lokayata school, isn't it?
Actually, that's right. It was the Lokayata, yeah, which means the materialists. Did somebody else have their hand up on this side?
I just have a translation question.
Yeah.
Where you're using the word beings, being reborn or not being reborn, what's the pattern that you recall on here?
The word that's rendered beings?
Yeah.
It's satta, or Sanskrit sattva.
S-A-T-T.
S-A-T-T-V-A. That's the Sanskrit. S-A-T-T-A is the Pali.
And is that literally beings, or if you were literally translating satta?
Yeah, yeah. It's often what's translated as sentient beings.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go on with the examination of this view. Okay, now in section 8, the Buddha is going to make some quite definitive statements of his own. You know, this is an interesting contrast with the famous Kalama Sutta, which is often quoted when anybody wants to introduce Buddhism to a non-Buddhist. Almost the first text they cite, this is what the Buddha says in the Kalama Sutta. And so this was the authoritative Buddhist text. Whereas it's just one little sutta, middle-sized sutta, in the 2,000-page Anguttara Nikaya. And for 2,000 years, more than that, 2,300, 400 years, nobody paid any special attention to the Kalama Sutta. Till some British rationalist in the late 19th century couldn't keep his discovery to himself, but he wanted to prove that the Buddha was like a 19th century British rationalist. So he said, look, see what we found. The Kalama Sutta, the Buddha doesn't make any pronouncements about karma, rebirth, anything beyond what you can see and know through your own experience. But this sutta starts off very similar to the Kalama Sutta, but here the Buddha pretty much lays down the line. By the way, there's also, I should mention that there is a Chinese counterpart to the Kalama Sutta. It's included in the Majjhima Agama of the Ahanjing. And in that sutta, it's very different from the Pali Kalama Sutta. It starts off in the same way, where the Kalamas come to the Buddha and they're quite perplexed. They don't know who to believe, what to accept. But in the Kalama Sutta translated into Chinese, the Buddha says, it's quite true that you are confused, perplexed, uncertain, because you don't have the higher knowledge to be able to distinguish what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. But I have that knowledge, and I will tell you what is good, what is bad, what is right, and what is wrong. And then the Buddha goes right ahead and tells them about the 3 unwholesome roots, 3 wholesome roots, 10 courses of unwholesome conduct, 10 types of wholesome conduct. So maybe the Pali version of the Kalama Sutta had been slipped in by a British rationalist of the 19th century. Okay, so here the Buddha is speaking quite definitively. He says, since there actually is another world, a world beyond this present one who holds the view there is no other world has wrong view. Okay, so the right view, as we'll see, is the view that there are worlds or lives beyond this present one. Since there is another world, one who intends, or I would say one who forms intentions, or acts on the motivation, or whose actions are motivated by the belief there is no other world, has wrong intention. Since there actually is another world, one who makes the statement, there is no other world, has wrong speech. And since there actually is another world, one who says there is no other world is opposed to those arahants, those liberated and enlightened ones who know the other world. So up to this point we have here wrong view, wrong intention, wrong speech. Those are the first 3 factors of the wrong Eightfold Path, which is the opposite of the right view, right intention, right speech, the first 3 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, so some other consequences. One who says there is no other world is opposing the arhats, the ones with the superior knowledge, who know about the other world. Okay, then when one starts arguing that there is no other world, arguing with another, then one can convince him to accept what is called untrue or a bad dhamma, a bad teaching. And then when one convinces the other to accept a bad teaching, then one praises oneself and disparages others. And then when one accepts this view, then any pure conduct that one had formerly possessed is abandoned, and one takes the ways, or gets led astray into corrupt behavior. Okay, so we have wrong view, wrong intention, wrong speech, opposing the noble ones, convincing another to accept a bad teaching, an untrue teaching, praising oneself, disparaging others. Okay, so these, they're called evil, unwholesome states or qualities, come into being with wrong view as their condition. Okay, so these are all bringing out the negative consequences, the undesirable consequences that follow from determining or deciding that there is no world beyond the present one, no life beyond the present one, and no working of the law of karmic cause and effect. Okay, so now in section 9, we come into the reflections of a wise person. How a wise person is going to reflect on deciding between these two opposed views. This is a person who's intelligent, reasonable, but isn't able to see and know for himself whether or not there are lives beyond the present one, whether or not there is a law of karmic causation, of moral causation. This, we could say that this is where the Buddhist